So just a little bit of background and context for this project. There's been quite a bit of increased interest by fisheries managers and researchers in catfish over the last 20 to 30 years. Some examples include the development of catfish management plans by numerous states. Texas finalized its catfish management plan in 2015. There's also been an increase in catfish research initiatives, and of course the Catfish Symposium starting in 2000. So one reason for the popularity of catfish for anglers is that they offer diverse angling opportunities, from small creeks and urban ponds to large rivers and impoundments. As Warren just alluded to, in a recent statewide survey of Texas catfish anglers, researchers identified several catfish angling groups based on various catch preferences. Catfishing also offers various methods of take, such as rod and reel, passive gears, and hand fishing. So there's also been some qualitative observations made by some biologists in Texas through the years, and I'm sure a lot of other locations in fisheries with relation to passive gear efficiency. Specifically, relative to rod and reel anglers, passive gear fishermen seemed pretty successful and effective in harvesting good numbers of fish. Additionally, these anglers seem to be pretty effective at catching larger specimens and harvest a greater proportion of larger fish in their creel relative to hook and line fishermen. So these are some of the observations and questions that we set out to address and quantify. So with that little bit of background in mind, our study objectives were to compare and assess differences in harvest and harvest efficiency between anglers using active and passive gear. We wanted to evaluate differences in harvest size composition between the groups. And finally, we wanted to assess differences in various creel dynamics and angler behaviors between anglers using these gear types. So this is an overview map of our study site, Choke Canyon Reservoir. Choke Canyon is roughly a 26,000 acre impoundment and is a highly popular catfish angling destination. Catfish rank either first or second in total directed effort, and this system is considered a high harvest system with over 100,000 fish harvested annually in some years. In addition to being an extremely popular and productive catfish destination, unpublished creel data indicated that roughly a third of our total catfish anglers were using passive gears. However, our current TPWD creel procedures do not attempt to collect or quantify passive angler data. This is primarily attributed to difficulty in collecting and quantifying this data based on creel design and how to standardize various metrics. Because of this, there's a potential to miss a substantial component on the catfish creel data on harvest, catch, and effort. So for our data collection, we implemented an access point creel. Data was collected annually from 2006 to 2010. In 2011, we collected data for the summer quarter only. We utilized creel data collected from 1999 to 2005 to define various strata in an effort to maximize the number of catfish creel interviews. Some pretty common levels of stratification were used and included day type broken out into weekend and weekday, a temporal strata with AM and PM time periods. The length of our time periods varied by quarter and were dependent on daylight hours. These time periods range from 5 to 6.5 hours in length. And finally, we had a spatial strata to capture all available access points. Very common creel metrics were collected to provide estimates of fishing effort, catch and harvest rates, harvest size composition, as well as some basic demographic and expenditure data. We also asked some questions to obtain additional information on angler behavior and catfish fishing dynamics. This included questions about night fishing activities and bait type use. So as far as all anglers, we asked everybody if they ever return to the boat ramp after dark, what percent of their fishing trips they return after dark, and what time they return to the boat ramp after dark. And for our catfish anglers, we asked them what type of bait they used for the day's trip. We also asked some questions specific to active and passive catfish anglers. For our active anglers, we asked them on average how many rod and reels they fished with during the day's trip. And for passive anglers, we asked them about the total hooks used, the number of hours they spent tending their lines, and also how many hours their lines fished since they were last set. So there's lots of information on this slide, but this is kind of a high-level overview of our data analysis components. So what we looked at first was harvest between active and passive gear types on a per party and per individual basis. Harvest per unit effort was used as a measure of harvest efficiency. Effort was defined as the number of hours fished for rod and reel anglers multiplied by the number of anglers. We felt the more appropriate measure of efficiency for passive gear was the number of hours spent tending the gear multiplied by the number of anglers in the vessel. So tending would be baiting, running, and resetting their lines. Kolmogorov-Smirnov tests of homogeneity were used to evaluate differences in harvest size composition between the angler gear types. We also constructed a contingency table to assess differences in the proportion of quality size blue catfish between the gears. And finally, we looked at some other dynamics in angler behaviors, such as trip expenditures, time of creel interception, length of trip, and the frequency of fishing trips that were completed during night hours. So kind of moving into some of the results, this figure is our catfish harvest size composition between the gear types. The stacked bar on the left represents our active harvest composition. Bar on the right is our passive gear species harvest composition. What we saw was that our harvest was dominated by blue catfish by both gear types. This was not really a big surprise to us, considering this fishery is dominated by blue catfish. We also saw a bit more harvest of channel catfish, around 11% in our rod and reel anglers, and a greater percent of flatheads in the harvest composition for passive gears. So this whisker and box plot illustrates the distribution of catfish harvest on a per party basis. So the next series of graphs are going to be pretty similar. The blue is going to represent our active gear data, orange passive gear data. So this one on the y-axis was our harvest on a per party basis. The main takeaway here was that harvest is pretty similar between the angling gear types, and that harvest is relatively low, around 11 to 12 fish per party per day. So here's a similar figure. This one is for harvest on an individual basis. Again, harvest was relatively low, and on average, individual anglers are only harvesting about 4 or 5 catfish per trip. Again, pretty low number and nowhere near the allowed 25 fish daily bag limit regulation on the reservoir. So results from this and the previous slide, no significant differences when looking at individual years and when the data was pooled across years. This box plot shows the distribution of harvest per unit effort. What we saw was that passive gear anglers were more efficient when looking at time invested and hours spent on the water. Harvest per effort rates were more than double that of rod and reel anglers. Found significant differences in all years and when the data was pooled. So here's the combined harvest size composition for all catfish across all years. We got size class in inches on the X, percent frequency on the Y. The link frequency in black represents our active gear and the light gray passive. Our Kolmogorov-Smirnov test of homogeneity did indicate significant differences in size composition between the gear types. And you can see we measured quite a few fish through the study period. This panel shows the KS test results for blue catfish by year only. Again, results indicated significant differences in the size composition, the size harvest composition between the angling gear types. This graph summarizes the chi-square results for blue catfish combined across years. And so the blue represents the proportion of blue catfish that were harvested less than 20 inches, and the orange is representative of our harvest of blue catfish that were at least 20 inches. Our chi-square results were significant, and you can see that about 5% of our rod and reel harvest was fish of 20 inches in total length, whereas 31% of our harvest contained fish of at least quality size for our passive gear. So getting into some of the angler dynamics information, this box plot illustrates the total number of interviews by gear type. And the main takeaway was that on average, passive gear anglers represented about 25% of our total interviews. It's a pretty substantial proportion. So digging a little bit deeper into interview times, here's a look at the number of creel interviews for angler gear type across our time strata. The number in parentheses is the percent of interviews that occurred within a given time period per gear type. So as an example, we had about 300 total interceptions for our passive gear anglers, of which 194 or 65% occurred during the morning time period. Conversely, 71% of our rod and reel interviews occurred during the afternoon, evening time period. So these data could have important implications in designing a creel to maximize passive or angler data collection depending on objectives. So recall from our methods section, we asked anglers while fishing at Choke Canyon Reservoir, do you ever return to the boat ramp after dark? This table summarizes those data. What we found was that of all the anglers intercepted, 16% of our active anglers have fished after dark. And that 27% of our passive gear anglers have fished at night. So when combined, roughly 19% of our catfish anglers have fished at night at least once on this system. So if they answered yes to the prior question, we would ask them what percent of their fishing trips to Choke Canyon Reservoir do they complete after dark. And so we use this information and the information from the previous slide to estimate what total percent of catfish fishing trips occurred during night hours. And so we could use this as a proxy, giving us an idea how much fishing effort and thus potential harvest occurred outside of our current creel time designations. What we found was that roughly 5 or 6% of our total fishing effort occurred outside our current creel period designations during daylight hours. And so based on this result, it seemed pretty reasonable to not conduct creels during nighttime hours when balancing things like efficiency and safety with additional data gained. So kind of bringing it all together with some implications, we found that catfish harvest was less than anticipated on a per party and per individual basis. Our study site was considered a high harvest system, yet on average we had about 11 or 12 fish per party and around 5 fish per individual per day. This has implications for regulations, as managers would have to substantially ratchet down on the bag and or length limits to make anglers throw fish back in enough numbers to affect fishing mortality rates. Additionally, the collection of passive gear creel data could be a vital data need to better inform catfish management. Recall that up to 31% of our total catfish interviews were from passive anglers. There is a potential to miss a substantial component of total effort and harvest without collecting that information. Passive gear data could also be useful to inform other regulations, such as a closed season or applicability of a trophy regulation. We found that harvest efficiency was greater for passive gear anglers in terms of their on-the-water investment of time. We also verified passive gears were selective for larger individuals, and that the deployment and use of passive gears like trot and jug lines may be useful as a supplemental gear to help achieve specific fisheries sampling objectives. We also discovered some important information and insights into angler behaviors, which should aid in creel design and in maximizing efficiency based on specific data objectives. As an example, if an objective was to collect information on the passive gear component of a fishery, we found that the AM time period would work best. And finally, we found there to be pretty limited nighttime catfishing effort to be occurring. And we felt when balancing all of the trade-offs, it is not necessary to conduct or extend creel time periods to encompass night hours. So I just wanted to acknowledge a few folks, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Inland Fisheries Corpus Christi District, team members Ray Madrano and Ray Cardona for collection of creel data, Aaron Bunch and Dusty McDonald for some assistance on some data analysis components, and of course this project was funded through federal aid and sport fish restoration. And if I got some time, I'm happy to address a question. Yeah.
Do you limit use of passive gear to any different kinds of water bodies?
Currently, no. There's no restriction on passive gear, except for maybe some CFLs, smaller urban water bodies. Yes, sir. Ben?
All boat anglers on this?
Yes, all boat anglers.
And next question, 5% of those folks fishing after dark at Choke Canyon, is there any reason that would be different at other impoundments?
It could be, but considering the fact this is a high effort, high harvest system, I'd say, it's
Like
pretty.
alligators or scare people off or anything?
No, I wouldn't say that. The folks in South Texas aren't too fearful of alligators, man. But, just being such a high harvest, high effort system, I'd be surprised. And passive gears, utilized quite a bit in the area. So I wouldn't think nighttime fishing effort would vary too much in some of the other lakes. It could, obviously. Yeah.
So to clarify that night fishing, you said 5 to 6% of all fishing effort occurred after dark.
Right.
Then 19% of all catfish anglers fished after dark.
So the 19%.
Was that sometime during the year they fished after dark?
Don't really know the time period. I'm assuming that wasn't specified. So the 19% represents the proportion of anglers that have fished after dark at least once on that system. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's the reg on the number of poles? Do you have a limit on?
There is no restriction on this water body for number of poles.
For passive gears, the same, how many hooks can you run?
I'm pretty sure, and somebody might be able to jump in, but I'm pretty sure it's 100 hooks per person per day.
Pretty much unlimited then.
More or less, yep. Yeah.
What's the regulation in Texas for how frequently a passive gear needs to be checked?
So when this study was going on, that was 10 days. That has changed recently. That has now been reduced down to 6 days.
Okay, so then the follow-up question would be, is there a way to filter the people that are launching on the lake coming off who just set their gear for the day versus the ones that actually went out and actively fished their passive gear that, were able to catch fish and keep them?
Yeah, so we didn't, that's a good question, and we didn't really address that with this study. What we did do was when they come off, the passive gear had fish on it. If they had just went and set their gear, we wouldn't conduct a creel interview with those guys. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Quick question.
One more?
Yeah. Do you do creel surveys on a per individual basis, or do you get information on the whole party?
We get information on the whole party.
Okay, so like your estimation of harvest per individual, that effort was somewhat standardized across each individual in a party, right?
Yes.
So if there's one person who's catching a lot more fish than the others.
All right, let me back up. So some information we collect on a per party basis. So we treat their creel bag as a group. Yeah, so I guess the answer would be no. We We didn't ask individuals, hey, how many of these did you harvest and what size were they? That would just take way too long and be a little bit tricky to do.
Some
So
states do it.
that's great.
Well, thanks,
I
Greg.
wouldn't want to do it, but
Thank you.
appreciate it, man.